I also just realized we've done, 300 episodes together, Douglas, something like that. Did you realize that we're Bob and Doug?
Well, I can never unhear that.
Hey, it's Bob and Doug McBetaKit.
Jesus. Hello and welcome to another AMA edition of the BetaKit podcast. Now, the format for these episodes is simple. We ask you for questions about Canadian tech or tech from a Canadian perspective, and then Rob and I try to tiptoe around them while getting our guests to answer. Our guest this week, Chris Neumann, general partner at Panache. Now, we've wanted Chris on for quite some time to talk to him about his blogging. We're very interested in his blog posts. But he got sick, so we smooshed him onto our AMA pod, so that we could pepper him with both our questions and yours. And this thing is packed. We've got doozies. Basically, every colleague of yours at Panache hits you with some really slanderous stuff at my request. I'm very appreciative of the Panache team for doing that. We might get to that stuff, but we got some other stuff to get to first. Let's dig in. Okay, kicking this off with something that I think is a very important. I think, well, honestly, one of the initial reasons why we're like, man, we got to get this Chris guy on, because I keep asking him to publish content on BetaKit, and he keeps refusing and publishing it on his own blog. So the only way that I can mine this content for my publication's benefit is to invite him on the podcast to talk about his articles and then link to them. Chris, why can't Canada afford a flight to fear? What were you expecting? Is something more professional than
You're
this,
going to
man?
read he's going to read his article from top to bottom in his
No,
podcast.
I was less expecting you to ask a question than Rob to burst out laughing.
Okay. This is how we do it, man. This is how we do it.
So one of the challenges we have in Canada, and to be clear, this isn't unique to Canada. This is true of a lot of countries not named the United States, is that our venture capital industry grew out of private equity. And private equity, by its nature, is historically quite conservative. And so what you see in Canada and in the UK and in other European countries is a VC industry that doesn't have the same risk-taking that we observe when we read articles on TechCrunch, where it seems like, US VCs are throwing around money like it's nobody's business, and you can cut a check off a napkin that somebody writes in the bathroom of a Pizza Hut. Now, the reality is it's somewhere in the middle, but there is some truth to the difference in approach. And so what happens, and what we need to be aware of, is that if our baseline as an industry is a little bit more conservative, and our roots are a little bit more conservative than VC in the US, when economic times get more challenging, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we have this inherent idea of conservativeness, and we can't retreat into that. In economically challenging times, really amazing companies are built, but there's a contrast with the approach of a lot of money managers, which is, hey, let's be a little more cautious, let's be a little more restrained at a time where we really need to be looking hard at what are the opportunities and how can we back some of these companies in what is likely to be a very competitive and incredible vintage of world-changing startups.
Okay, how much of that, and this is a great lead in to just talk about the writing that you've been doing, which has been, I think, roundly enjoyed. And again, a lot of people are asking us questions saying, I want you to ask him about this blog post that he did. How much of what you just described is a cultural attitude, Canadian nature that we need to reconcile with, deal with, and how much is actually maybe a reflection of that, the state of play on the ground relative to the U.S. state of play? Like I haven't seen a funding deal in a Pizza Hut since I was a young lad, but it seems like you are doing a little bit of load-bearing lifting, describing to the ecosystem some base level expectations or why and how we're different from other markets. Like you're not writing about, the value of safe agreements or like how to do your prep or things like that. This is really some I think, focused on how we see ourselves, how we approach certain things, and how Canada is different. So where are you falling on that line of like, there's an educational component here to like how Canada is different, and maybe I need to educate Canadians to act a little different?
That's a great question. And I think there's an important distinction to make, which is although my writing is about the Canadian ecosystem and helping understand the differences between Canada and Silicon Valley, and I'll get back to why I'm saying Silicon Valley specifically, you could replace Canada with 50 other countries around the world in many of those articles. It's really important for people to understand that Canada isn't the outlier. Silicon Valley is. Silicon Valley is a global outlier in terms of how its tech ecosystem and capital ecosystem evolved. And I'm not saying the United States. In fact, if you were to go to any city in Middle America or most of the United States outside of California, you would find that the dynamics of those tech ecosystems have more in common with Canada than they do with Silicon Valley. It really does fundamentally operate differently from the rest of the world. Now, the reason why the educational component is so important is that a lot of the knowledge that I'm talking about and I'm writing about are things that are actually quite well understood to founders who live in San Francisco.
Shots fired.
Not really. Like the reality is, if you live in San Francisco, there is such a density of founders and investors and repeat founders and repeat investors. You learn a lot just by being there and talking to people. If you are anywhere other than Northern California, you have to actually put an effort to learn some of these things. And this dynamic is a global dynamic relative to Silicon Valley. In Canada's case, the opportunity comes from our proximity. We are uniquely situated by virtue of the fact that we are the English-speaking, very closely aligned economy right across the street from this massive tech market. And so unlike any other country in the world, we're best positioned to make the leap.
So we're literally the best positioned by being right next door, but it also rubs the lack of an exceptionalism in our face a bit, but that's also the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I lived in the Bay Area for almost 20 years, and seeing the distinctions between Canada and the US and the culture and the degree to which Canadians define themselves in comparison to the US, and certainly not vice versa. But if we put that to the side and we just say, hey, you know what? This is who we are. There's huge, huge advantages from that geographic proximity. Absolutely massive advantages. I'm sitting here in Vancouver. Vancouver is the only major international city in the world in the same time zone as San Francisco. It's a massive advantage that we don't come anywhere close to maximizing or capitalizing on. And there's a lot of those things. Second one, Canada is the only country that virtually every American VC is willing to write an investment into. I'll say that again. US VCs are overwhelmingly willing and able to write checks into Canadian domiciled companies. That's something that is a significant shift in the last 5 years, and it's something that is not true of any other country on the planet. So we really are the best positioned to capitalize on this. However, we have to acknowledge and understand that we are competing with what's happening south of the border. And the companies in particular that are formed and being built in the Bay Area have the unfair advantage of this higher level of default knowledge that permeates that ecosystem. So we've got to level that up.
So let's tie that back then to the Canadian moment, because going back to opportunity acknowledged, proximity acknowledged, not being able to afford a flight to fear. Part of that is the educational component. It's the conservative mindset. But if we look at some of the things in your posts, the quotes here, flight to quality, money pouring into the best companies, that inherent conservatism in a downturn stuff. But from our reporting, our readers will also know that Canadian VCs are in a position where they are having LPs pull out of deals, VCs are pulling out of deals, they are clawing back investments from startups, and we published that story in early January. It has only gotten worse or more commonplace to discuss, and you will see future stories on BetaKit further articulating the willingness of some Canadian VCs to continue to back their current investments. Can you reconcile the Canadian mentality with also the moment right now and maybe the economics behind some of those decisions? Because it doesn't seem purely driven by the fact that valuations were nutsoid in 2021. It also seems like there's an unwillingness or an inability to do something more than like, what's in it for me? I mean, would that be an accurate read? Because I've got founders done with their investors, and I've got investors wondering why they are investors in this space if these are the types of things they have to deal with day by day.
So it's a loaded question.
Yeah, I cocked that thing back. Thank you for being on the podcast, sir. We very much appreciate it. I've been waiting.
So let me take that in a couple of parts. The first one is I think it would be unfair to Canada to suggest that somehow it is Canadian behavior that's driving some of what we're seeing in the ecosystem. The fact of the matter is, right now, we are seeing what I will politely call shitty behavior from VCs around the world. Not just Canadian investors, not just American investors. There is a small cohort of investors who are unequivocally and unapologetically looking out for their own interests. Founders be damned, other investors be damned, frankly, reputation be damned. That is an unfortunate thing that happens every single downturn. The solace that I will give to founders that have to go through this is the founders and the ecosystem has a long memory. I promise you, there is no founder on the planet that ever forgets an investor who treated them poorly. And I promise you, their other investors know as well. Myself and every other investor I know has a long list of people we will not deal with again. And so that doesn't make the situation any easier. And I will tell you, there's a special place in hell for investors who intentionally screw over their founders with no empathy for the journey or the challenges that they are going through. People like that, I question what they're doing in this business. But we have to also acknowledge this is a capitalist industry. We are literally called venture capitalists. So at the end of the day, we're money managers. Our job is to generate returns for our investors. And it is up to each and every individual investor and their firms to decide how to balance that with ethics, with founder empathy, with the type of relationship you want to have with the community and the type of impact you want to have with the ecosystem that is the basis for your success. Because frankly, at the end of the day, founders can build companies without investors. We can't. If founders won't take our money, we're out of business. There's another really important dynamic that's at play here that we also need to be aware of, which is far too often founders don't have realistic expectations about follow-on capital. On the one hand, yes, we are seeing a small number of bad actors who are causing problems, but a larger cohort of these challenges come from founders not understanding how, when, and why investors are able to put in follow-on capital. Many times they don't ask the question. They just presume, if I'm in trouble, my investor is going to be there and they're going to write a bridge. But the fact of the matter is many funds don't actually have that in their financial model. And certainly not to the degree where they can afford to bridge every company that they've invested in a cyclical downturn like this. I did a post once, going back to my blog called, "Do You Still Love Me?" Most founders don't check in with their investors and say, "Hey, do you still love me? Are you still willing to write a check?" every investment firm keeps score of their perspective of their companies, whether it's red, yellow, green, or however we're thinking about it. And when they are in a situation where they have to make a decision of do we bridge this company or not, some of those decisions are really hard. And it can feel like a breakup. It can feel like an investor has turned on you, or they didn't stick to their word, or they didn't do what needed to be done when times got tough. But the reality is most founders never asked, and they assumed that things were going to be there. And unfortunately, it often ends up with hard feelings for what are coming down to some pretty consequential business decisions. It's a situation where, if you're a founder right now and you haven't actually had a conversation with your investors about their follow-on policy, their reserve strategy, where you sit and how they view you, that's a really important conversation to have before you get up to the ledge and you're in trouble. Insert something about the old saying of acid.
Oh, I was going to say, when you find out that 100x revenue is no longer a thing that you can raise at?
Yeah, or whatever, right? I mean, bridge decisions aren't actually always made, and in fact, they're rarely made on milestones, right? If you hit your milestones to plan, then you wouldn't need a bridge. Most VCs make bridges when they see founders that are working really hard. The founders have kept them up to date. They're seeing them make progress. It's taking longer than expected, or something fell through, but they still have conviction in the founding team. If they don't have conviction in the founding team anymore, the bridge probably isn't there. And if they don't have the ability to do that bridge, if that's not built into their financial model, it doesn't matter how awesome the founding team is. They just might not have the capital to do that. And so these questions are really, really important for founders to ask and understand. Will you bridge me? Do you have the capability to bridge me? Under what terms will you bridge me? In what scenarios will you bridge me? What do I have to achieve to still be in that conversation? And in some regards, a bridge is still another fundraising discussion, right? You're still pitching to your existing investors. And the challenges really do come up when investors just make these assumptions. And we all know the old saying of what happens when you assume.
I don't know if you remember the dot-com bust. There was a fucked company. What was it? Like fuckcompany.com?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Remember that? Like
I
you
remember
could
that
post, people would anonymously post, my company's about to go out of business. And then there was a website called The Funded, which were anonymous people sharing stories about their investors. And it's like, is this person a good person? It's funny, I haven't seen at least evidence of those kinds of artifacts showing up yet. Maybe they exist and I'm not cool enough to join them, which is very
We don't have access to the Discord right now.
The meta point that you're making, Chris, is like, you're talking about almost like a VC cold start problem in a sense. And entrepreneurs these days, especially in the last, say, 5-6 years, they're going to go where the money is. So while the ecosystem might be trying to build itself, if they need to move to the Valley, they're going to get money from the Valley. They're not like, there are some who are somewhat provincial, but they're like, they don't need to take money from Canadians. So that you have to present as Panache has to present as compelling a case as YC, for example, or somebody else. Maybe that's a bad example, but you see my point. I don't know how to say this, but are we kind of fucked because we're going to be right back into this thing of like, we should do these things. Cool. The founders are going to go down south of the border and get higher valuations or use arbitrage in their favor and blah, 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 blah.
So there's a few layers to that question that we really need to give consideration to, right? It's easy to say, okay, if valuations are higher, go to the US, but it's never that simple. The way to think of valuations, again, I'm going to not use US. I'm going to use Silicon Valley. Because if you go and you try to raise funding in Kansas City, I promise you it's very close to a Calgary valuation. In Silicon Valley, the valuations are global valuations. VCs that are based in the Bay Area are the only investors in the world that see global deal flow, right? So if you think about it as a founder, you're going to raise at home or you're going to raise in Silicon Valley. A Canadian founder isn't going to suddenly wake up one day and go, you know what, I'm going to fly over to Istanbul and try to raise my seed round there.
Israel's cool. Let's do that.
Israel's cool. But the reality is US VCs are making investment decisions with considerably more information than VCs anywhere else in the world. They have the privilege of seeing what's happening in every major ecosystem. And as a result of that, when they see companies they like, they have a much higher conviction that that company is likely to be one of the best in the world. And as a result, they're willing to pay more for the privilege of being on that cap table. They're willing to pay more for the equity. An average Canadian investor only sees companies in Canada. So unless they have an extensive network in other countries, when they're making an investment decision, they often know, okay, it's the best in Canada. Maybe it's better than a few data points I have elsewhere, but I don't have that full conviction of knowledge. Now, the flip side to that is that not every company from outside the Valley is ready to go compete in that market, right? It's sort of like saying, well, I went to play on my pond hockey team and they didn't put me in, so I'm going to go knock on the front door to Maple Leaf Gardens and they're just going to let me in, right? There's a bit of naivety as to this idea that you just show up and money gets thrown at you in briefcases. With everything, there's a little bit of gray area in the middle. This is really important when you consider the earliest stage of funding, which is where Panache plays, which is the pre-seed. Globally, pre-seed investment overwhelmingly happens locally. It is very rare, even for great companies, that you raise pre-seed investment from outside of the city or region where you live. Why? Because at the pre-seed, you typically don't have product, you almost never have revenue, you're really betting on the team. And unless you're a repeat founder, the experience is more like a job interview, right? I'm looking at your resume. I'm looking at what school you went to, what your other jobs were. I'm trying to do background references. The value in anyone's background that earlier in their career diminishes the further away that you go from where they live. So for example, I went to undergrad at Simon Fraser University. Virtually nobody in the Bay Area has ever heard of it. In fact, when I tell people that I went to SFU, they're like, oh, you went to San Francisco University. There is no such thing, right? And so as a result, the early stage of funding is angel investors, pre-seed investors, and the like. And so what you'll see in my writing is I'm not talking about us needing to drive more Canadian Series B VCs. In fact, I don't care if there are any more Canadian Series B VCs. I don't think it matters. But what does matter is the grassroots support for our tech ecosystem. If we want more Canadian players in the NHL, we need a better infrastructure for 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds and so on, right? You can't suddenly stand up a new league for 15-year-olds and expect a different result. The same is true in startups. We need to have more capital at the pre-seed. We need to have more angel investors. We need to have more pre-seed VCs that are willing to take risks, because at that stage, it is highly unlikely that a founder can go to the US and raise that capital. It just doesn't happen as often.
So that kind of leads into one of the next questions that we had kind of submitted here, which is related to your right, like, why aren't there more VCs in my city? I think following the hockey analogy, what we need is that early stage share, and that's coming from more Canadian LPs. I want to maybe put a pin in that, and we'll include in the link show notes those articles, because I think people can kind of connect the threads here. I want to go to actually another one of the submitted questions that we got from, and I'm flipping the script here. I'm jumping right to it because it directly relates to what you were speaking to. This one's from Martin. I want to say Hawk, H-A-U-C-K, from K-Swear. He wants to know what your take is on SPVs, special purpose vehicles, and syndicates for early stage investments. In that continued analogy of the getting them playing ever younger, if we want a well-developed farm system, there's the LP component, but there's different types of early stage investments. But as you were noting previously, the types of investors that might have commitments for follow-on after the initial investment is really, really important. And we know that we've seen a lot of like ex-Shopify people who were suddenly VCs who suddenly weren't able to kind of continue investing. What is your take on this? Because this is maybe parallel to your space a little bit, but a different mechanism, if not an entirely different thesis.
Yeah. So the first thing I'm gonna hit you a little bit on this one, Doug. I don't think we should ever knock anyone who decides to start investing and backing Canadian startups, and then suddenly, for whatever economic reason, they have to pull back. So the fact that a number of folks who had a liquidity event at Shopify chose to put some of that capital into backing the next generation of Canadian startups is absolutely amazing, and they should be celebrated. We need more people who are willing to do that.
I would agree, but to punch back a little bit, I would also think it's easier to celebrate them if they had structured something that allowed them to do follow-on investments and been in a position to continue support. And maybe that's the difference between high net worth angels who have that liquidity event. And, you were talking about how much things have changed in the last 5 years. The difference between what Ryan Holmes was doing with his kind of maple syrup mafia of syndicate investments and participating and amortizing that cost a little bit, and then people exiting and being like, I now have a $10 million fund. I'm a full-time VC is a little different. I'm not knocking anyone who jumps into this space and tries to make anything happen because I know personally how hard it is. But I do think related to this question coming from someone who works at a startup, helping them understand the different, like how different the same amount of money might be depending upon who it comes from, I think really speaks to what you set up off the top. Would you agree?
So, going back to my earlier point, right? And I don't know the particular funds or individuals you're referring to, but, you mentioned the capability of doing follow-on funding. The vast majority of solo GP funds don't do follow-on. They don't have enough money. Right. And so there's an expectation mismatch there, which is, many folks who decide to come into VC, and let's be clear, they're not playing VC, they're making a career move with their own capital. They go in and they're trying to build up a resume by investing in companies. So if we take this one step further and we go beyond just, some of these folks who had a liquidity event and decided to start investing, more broadly, the last 3 to 4 years, we saw an explosion in the number and types of investment vehicles. We saw rolling funds come up, which were effectively subscription services for investing. We saw solo funds, small funds, operator funds, right? Where you had somebody who was a CEO who had a side hustle as as an investor, right? Everybody wants to be the next weekend fund. We saw SPVs as another example of that. All of these have a couple of things in common. Number one, they're typically not incredibly experienced investors. Number two, in many cases, the capital isn't secured. So if you think about, for example, a rolling fund typically operates on a quarterly basis. And I get a bunch of LPs to say they're going to commit every quarter and they're going to put in 50K or 10K or whatever the number is. Guess what? Economic conditions change and those subscribers start to churn. So what was previously $1 million a quarter fund, maybe suddenly it's 500K a quarter. SPVs are effectively syndicates for allocation. And what we saw people who had great deal flow, who didn't necessarily want to raise a fund, were structuring one-off investments and saying, okay, I'm going to get allocation in this company. I'm going to get a bunch of people to invest. We'll put the money in and I get part of the outcome. What that behavior translated into was a lot of folks coming in and fighting their way for allocation that they couldn't necessarily fill. But what we're seeing now is a number of individuals who are continuing to represent themselves as though they already have the capital to invest, and they're securing allocations. Founders are making decisions during their fundraising process, assuming that that money is secured, only to find out later that somebody who told them, hey, you know what, I'll put in 200, I'll put in 500, whatever the number is, comes back and says, well, actually, I don't have that money. And I think what we're going to see is pretty quickly, we're going to see those actors get sort of flushed out of the ecosystem, because you can't do that for very long. And, for a long time, they were able to, really funnel capital into good companies, right? I'm not trying to say that these are inherently bad actors, but they're individuals who are continuing to, in some cases, represent that they have capital secured that hasn't. So I think as it relates to SPVs, I think they're a useful vehicle. They can potentially be very helpful in bringing together a large number of small checks. But for founders who are fundraising, if somebody's saying, hey, you know what, I can fill this round, or I can do this through an SPV, you need to have a really hard conversation with them and a really direct conversation. Do you have this capital secured? How much are you personally putting in? How long will it take you to secure the rest? And what are the milestones we're going to see, between now and then, right? And it's not a blank check, look, you've got this allocation. It's you need to show me that you've got this much secured in 7 days, 14 days, whatever the number might be.
Is any of that concern inhibited by traditional angel networks that might be a little bit more established, a little bit more robust than, an AngelList syndicate or just like a network of whomever? Or are the concerns that you're laying out right now in this moment really extending down to the angel ecosystem in Canadian tech?
Well, I think they're two separate issues, right? The underlying challenge with SPVs, if there is an intermediary, is that you don't know who's writing the check, right? So if somebody's coming to you and say, look, I've got a great network, I can fill this up. In the past, that was a fantastic way to, fill holes in a round. And oftentimes they could bring a number of folks to the table. But in a situation where the economy is less confident, you don't necessarily know, is the person leading the SPV good for it? Or you may not know that. With angel investors, if you speak to an angel investor and you say, hey, are you interested in investing? 99% of them, if they're not in a position to do it, will say, hey, look, this is awesome. I'm not investing right now.
Well, angel groups and angel organizations might also invest through a syndicate, and you're not necessarily talking to everyone there, right? Like they're pulling from a...
They do. It depends. You're right. It depends on what the angel group is and what their mechanism is. And is the syndicate the vehicle to facilitate the investment, or is it the actual manner? And you just need to ask good questions and understand, if you're working through an angel group, what is their process, right? And at the end of the day, angel groups, their reputation does rely on transparency in their process. So it's not in their best interest to suggest to you, yeah, we'll absolutely invest, and then they do a vote later and they don't, right? So you're not going to see angel groups acting in quite the same way we're seeing with SPVs, where frankly, in some situations, people are trying to present themselves as something other than what they are. And again, I want to be clear, this is a minority of situations, right? The majority of people who are investing, regardless of whether angel investors, VCs, whatnot, are good people who present themselves, accurately. It is a loud and unfortunately impactful minority. And again, not unique to Canada, right? This happens in the US all the time, happens in Silicon Valley all the time, that do these things. It's just that in our ecosystem, the number of investors are so small that when these things happen, they reach the front page of BetaKit. When these things happen in the US, the founders kick them to the curb and they go find another investor.
From February 27th to March 31st, join changemakers across Canada for the 5th annual International Women's Week. Throughout International Women's Week, the Invest Ottawa community will host over 25 powerful events to participate in. But International Women's Week is far more than a set of activities. It is a call for long-term sustainable change. BetaKit is proud to join forces under a shared goal to inspire, equip, and empower more women. To learn more about how you can join in, visit www.investottawa.ca/IWW. So we've been talking about an honest articulation of the current state of play of the ecosystem and some of the considerations you have to make in 2023 that maybe you didn't have to in years past. One of those considerations is still might be around accelerators and incubators. As BetaKit recently covered, FounderFuel is back, not only through Real Ventures, but through Panache and Innovia, a bit of a triumvirate that's bringing it national. This question comes from Louis-Félix Binet, who is the executive director of Maine out of Quebec. And his question is, are accelerators and incubators doing a good or bad job fostering a thriving Canadian ecosystem? What could they or the people, orgs, institutions funding them do better? Super topical question, given the moment in the news, but then also given, prior to COVID, we were seeing a lot of incubators and accelerators struggle, whether they were campus linked, government backed, what have you. All of that said, 2023 is a very different time. So if you want to speak to why maybe Panache got involved with a notable founded accelerator program, but then take that broader, I'm sure you and your team have been digging into this a bit. I want to hear what you have to say.
Sure. And for the benefit of listeners who might not know, I probably have a unique view on this topic in Canada. In a past life, I helped to run 500 Startups global flagship accelerator in San Francisco. I've helped to run accelerators on multiple continents. I've founded an accelerator that started in person and transitioned to virtual during COVID, and a pretty substantive exposure to accelerators and incubators in all over the world. I think there's a nuance that needs to be understood about accelerators, which is on the one hand, and I'm going to use the word accelerator and incubator interchangeably for now, just for the purpose of discussion. The vast majority of people who found incubators and accelerators are coming from a good place. They're wanting to help the ecosystem grow. They're wanting to help build infrastructure to take knowledge of what it might take to build a successful company and make that accessible to first-time founders. That is a noble goal. The challenge comes in, frankly, whether or not they know how to do that. And if we think about accelerators, incubators as educational platforms, in every other type of education, we have good schools and we have bad schools. We have schools that have top-notch teachers, and we have schools that have less effective teachers, and all of the other things that go along with that. If you look at these programs holistically, the biggest question to ask and the easiest way to distinguish between good and bad, effective and ineffective programs is, what's the equity value that's been created out of them? The companies that came through these programs, did any of them do something meaningful? Now, some of these programs, you won't be able to say that, because if you look at an accelerator, an incubator in a small town somewhere, by the numbers, they're unlikely to start minting multi-billion-dollar companies.
That's that hometown hockey metaphor continued again, right? They're just trying to get people on the ice.
They're trying to get people on the ice. They're trying to create 40, 50, 60 person businesses. That's awesome. And when you go into larger ecosystems, the goals become more ambitious, or they become more diverse. They could be goals around financial returns. They could be goals around getting people to from underrepresented backgrounds a leg up. They could be focused on increasing a particular type of company. So all of these are good things. But if we go back to how the programs get run, what you need to start asking and what you need to look at as a founder is, how is the program run, and who are the individuals who are providing the service, providing the education? Are they founders themselves? Are they VCs who are donating their time, who kind of know what success looks like, or exited founders who are contributing? Or are they folks who, maybe haven't had those success, right? Maybe haven't seen what good looks like. And the risk with a lot of these, unfortunately, is you end up with programs that are effectively the blind leading the blind, which isn't to say that there's not some value in it. But, if we call it an accelerator, it's really got to accelerate things.
What about the consideration just related to changes that we've seen in terms of, like, you use the university to school analogy. This is one where there are not only good schools and bad schools that you might pay money to be educated in. This is actually one where you're giving away equity and they're giving you money. And the terms of those are a little different. We've seen since the pandemic, YC kind of up what they're offering in terms for the amount of equity that they're taking. What's the consideration mechanism there? And again, maybe how are you looking with FounderFuel to make that compelling in addition to the other components you laid out?
So one of the important things to understand is that the value from an accelerator isn't the cash that's coming. And a lot of folks will focus on, well, if I take this program, I get 50K. If I go to this other program, I go to 150K. The way most accelerators think about that capital is it's actually just intended to sustain the company through the period while they're in the accelerator. And so Bay Area accelerators increase their injection of capital as a function of being in the accelerator, frankly, to keep pace with cost of living. If you think about this university analogy, it is way better as a student if you don't have to have a part-time job while you're going through school. You're going to capture more of the value there. And that's really what it is.
If you can add some flavor to the ramen noodles, you're good.
Exactly. You can have some flavor to the ramen noodles. You don't have to stay up, till 2 a.m. working your job to buy books. It's the same thing here. The way that I would encourage folks to think about the trade-off or the cost for a program is in terms of the equity. You have to give up whatever it is, 4%, 5%, 6%, 7%, in exchange for this program. Do you believe that this particular program will help your company get further ahead to a degree that will justify giving that amount of your equity up? And in some cases, yes. In some cases, no. In some cases, you don't know and you find out later. Typically, the amount of equity is palatable, right? You're usually not seeing accelerators say, look, I want 25% of your company, right? And most founders, myself included, when they look back at, their cap table and their allocation of equity, there's usually 5 or 10% where you're just like, man, I made some dumb decisions. I shouldn't have given that away. And so it's also okay to make a mistake that early on, right? If you and your co-founders are in control of most of the cap table and there's this educational opportunity that seems compelling and it's 4, 5, 6%, and you've talked to some folks who've gone through the program and they've all said, yeah, this was really good, this helped us, well, then it's probably a good decision.
How would you then rate how our current slate of incubators and accelerators are doing? Like, noting that the kind of conditions for startups to evaluate are the ones on offer right now. And again, new FounderFuel cohorts coming. I'm sure it's going to be very great. Everyone's very excited that it's coming back. What can these orgs be doing better, and how well are they doing right now in the market?
I think of accelerators and incubators, again, I'm going to keep using this university analogy. The best students can go to any school they want. If you are one of the top startups anywhere in the world and you want to go to an accelerator, you can get into YC and you're going to go to YC. Hands down, full stop. But there are other programs all over the world, including Canada, that provide appropriate accelerators. Creative Destruction Lab, which I'm an associate of, is a phenomenal program. And by the way, it doesn't cost anything. There's a number of accelerators that are industry specific. There are climate tech accelerators, and ocean tech accelerators, and deep science accelerators, and space, and bloody well anything you might imagine. There's a program for that. Most of the programs in Canada are generalist accelerators. And what those are really about is learning how to start up. These programs, I think, can be valuable insofar as if you are a first-time founder, you've never started a business before, you don't know a lot of folks who have, and you're looking for that guidance in terms of, okay, we've got an idea. How do we bring it to market? How do we get to product market fit? The right accelerator and incubator can be phenomenal. The flip side to your question of, well, how do we compare? How do we do that? It's kind of hard to do that because accelerators that are local in nature are a product of the startups being created by that ecosystem. So if you were to look at a local accelerator in Edinburgh or Kansas City or whatever city you want to pick, it's a bit more difficult to say, is this a good or a bad accelerator? Because they tend to just draw from the local population. So at the end of the day, are you seeing the companies that come out of that program in the upper echelon of whatever that region is creating? And if the answer is yes, then it's probably a good program.
Okay, so don't overlook the Simon Frasers, but understand that if you're going there, you're not going to Harvard.
Well, or you're comparing the output of SFU is not going to be helpful in comparing it to the output of Harvard because the input is different. And so to bring it back to FounderFuel, FounderFuel historically has been a very successful program. And if you look back at what was created and the companies that have come out of FounderFuel, there's some pretty notable success stories in there, and all credit to the team running that for a number of years now. The reason why we got involved is we've seen over the last kind of 2-3 years since the pandemic hit and they paused it, gap in the Montreal ecosystem. We've seen that program has been consequential to the success of startups there. And we believe it's really important for that to be back and running in the Quebec ecosystem, right? The Quebec ecosystem is the second largest startup ecosystem in Canada, and it's missing a core component of what has historically helped to create successful companies there. And so I think as we looked at that and the opportunity arose, Real, Inovia, and ourselves, it was an easy decision to help bring this back to the ecosystem because it is something that's really historically had a pretty big impact. And, frankly, trying to pull that a little further beyond the Quebec borders and pull in some companies from across Canada and make the most of that opportunity. So we think it's a great opportunity. We think it's something that will have a meaningful, positive impact on the ecosystem, and we're looking forward to helping to bring it back.
You had said something just a moment ago about kind of identifying the sectors as it relates to incubators and accelerators. We had an email submitted question that I thought might be a nice quick follow-up to this. Just someone, and apologies, I do not have your name, anonymous person. I just know it came via email, so thank you. If you've ever got a question for a future AMA, podcast at BetaKit is the place to send it. They wanted to know the best advice for a founder raising pre-seed in the edtech space.
EdTech is a difficult space. We have not historically seen a lot of VC scale exits in the space. And part of the reason has to do with how educational products get purchased. If you're going into universities, they may be lengthy procurement processes. If you're selling into elementary schools or high schools, the process can differ by district. And so you have this patchwork of purchasing. Is the school the one doing the purchasing, or is it passing through the costs to the parents? If it's the latter, parents are already squeezed for costs. And so it can be very difficult to offer something compelling enough for the educational institution to even broach the idea of passing the cost. And so the question in EdTech always becomes, who ultimately is going to pay for this? And is the thing that you're creating compelling enough in what is not only a competitive market, but an increasingly global market and a cost-constrained market? How are you going to get through that? And so it's quite a hard thing.
And what do you need to do to get access to that purchase decision maker? Where it's like, oh no, the universities will love to pay for this as soon as we have all of their students on board and it's used across like if you can't attack that purchase decision maker until XYZ ABCD is in place, again, to your point, ed tech is tough.
It's tough. And so if I were a pre-seed founder, my advice would be to do as much as you can to generate some form of revenue. We often get caught up in this, how much traction do you need and whatnot question. But EdTech is one where, very truthfully, the ability to show that I can get revenue from whatever target customer you have is hugely important and far more important than other industries because of how tough we know it to be to sustainably sell and grow market share.
Okay. We got just 2 questions left to wrap this up. Closing this off with something a little bit more open-ended, a little bit more wistful, a little bit more just openly philosophical, introspective. This question comes from George Damien out of Catalyst, and he wanted to know, what opportunity did you pass on that you wish you hadn't and why? Now, I'm assuming that's coming from a VC deal perspective, but over the course of this podcast, you've kind of laid out your CV and like all the alternate lives you've lived. So if there's something else there, it's like, no, I really want to be running an accelerator again. Well, I guess from our last question, we know you're involved in one of those again. But like broad spectrum here, opportunity? Because it's kind of come de rigueur for VCs to start passionately talking about the deals that they missed to let people know that they were at least maybe in on that. But do you see this from just companies that you missed putting a check into, or like how do you see opportunity? Because we've been talking about that a lot on this podcast.
Yeah. So, every VC, every investor that I've ever met has an anti-portfolio that's better than their actual portfolio. The anti-portfolio being the things that they had the opportunity to, but didn't.
Anti-portfolio is also where Bizarro Superman lives.
Right. And some of these folks just like won't shut up about it. Well, I had the opportunity to invest in that. Okay, cool. The reality is that for good investors, the anti-portfolio serves as education. So when I look back at every investment that I passed on, I can look back and say, look, I wouldn't have changed it. I passed on it because it matched my opportunities. So for example, there were some great companies that when I was an angel investor, I passed on because I was too valuation sensitive. Right. And as I, grew in my career, I realized, wow, I probably should have done that deal. There were other companies that I passed on because of the stage. Right. So, it doesn't make sense for an angel investor to write a check in a Series A or a Series B company. Later, I better understood that math. And when I had an opportunity to do so, again, I made a different decision. In cases where I didn't invest in a company because I lost out on that opportunity, that was also a learning opportunity, right? There's been companies that I had the opportunity to invest in and didn't because I was too slow or wasn't as aggressive in the term sheet or took too long doing diligence or asked too many questions or whatever the case may be. And those all feed my growth as an investor and they help me to get better. And so I don't tend to think of it as like, oh, shucks, I missed that or something to lament or something to look back on and, either with pride or with derision. It's really opportunities to become a better investor and become a better student of this discipline. At the end of the day, VC is an apprentice business. And a lot of people don't understand that, right? If you think about the fact that VC is a mystery to a lot of founders, well, guess what? There's no operating manual when you get into being a VC. And, crazier yet, if you're a pre-seed VC, where you're investing in companies where you aren't likely to see returns for 7 to 10 years, it means for 7 to 10 years, you have no idea if you're any good at this, right? And so you really have to be focused on learning from every opportunity you get, whether they're peers, whether they're opportunities to invest, things you missed, the founders we meet every day. One of the best things about being an investor is I learn from every founder I talk to. I learn about their businesses. I learn about their industries. I become a better investor by virtue of simply interacting with people in the ecosystem, which is why the best investors I know of spend so much time talking to founders, because that's how we get better at what we do.
I look forward to you coming back on this podcast for like the 10-year anniversary AMA, where you're like, okay, I got it now. Here's my 5. You're just like,
yeah, it's going to be either like, wow, I'm really good at this, or it turns out I suck, guys. I'm going to go back and start an accelerator.
To that point, though, of doing opportunity evaluation constantly, not only to better learn, but that in itself is an opportunity. I think the final question I want to ask you, and this kind of ties back to your writing, other than BetaKit stories, Chris, what do VCs talk about?
What do VCs talk about?
And what are they talking about right now? We've alluded to some things. I was, I loaded my double-barrel shotgun and pumped you with a question, and then you check raised with a pretty hearty response. This is a weird and interesting time. Conversations are ongoing. Apparently, VCs like talking to founders. But what are they really talking about right now? Because you had pointed out that founders really need to talk to their VCs to see if they still love them, to see what's going on and checking on all that. And that is both best practice, but then also like a really good survival tip right now. How is that on the other side? Because for a lot of people looking in right now, not finding deals, wondering what's going on, seeing the layoffs, your component of the financial management system, the stack, is a bit of a black box right now. So when you kick back, when I'm not around, when I'm saying like, I'm going to go get another beer over here, and I disappear for 15 minutes, you're like, great, he's gone. And you turn back to all the other VCs I interrupted at the event with, what are you talking about?
Well, after we're done talking about your amazing fashion style, honestly, VCs share a lot of information. And, I think a lot of founders are used to seeing VCs as competitors. They're used to, okay, I've got term sheets and I've got investors kind of battling against each other. But the reality is the vast majority of investors get along very well with each other and share a ton of information. Many of us have worked at overlapping companies. We cross firms all the time. It's a very small industry. And so a lot of time is just spent kind of sharing information what we're seeing. So like last week, I was down in San Francisco for a week, and I met up with a whole bunch of VCs. And a lot of the conversations were like, okay, here's what we're seeing in Canada. What are you seeing down there? Here's what we're seeing with the deal flow. What are you guys seeing? Here's what we're seeing with valuations. What's your hypothesis? What's your hypothesis? Sometimes it's gossiping about startups in the news the same way everybody else does. But mostly it's really a lot of genuine information sharing in order to figure out how to better support the ecosystems that we're in, how to work together. A lot of the VCs I was talking to last week, we were talking about Collision and, hey, can I get you guys to come up here? Come up to Collision with us. It's a great event. You guys should come up to Toronto. It really is a ton of information sharing and, the vast majority of it from a positive place of trying to back the global startup tech ecosystem. And I realize that might sound a little fluffy and a little fairy tale-ish, but at the end of the day, the vast majority of people who have the privilege of doing what I do really deeply want to make the world a better place. And a lot of our conversations are about how we can collectively do that.
Okay. I don't believe that for a second, but I believe it when you say it because I think you mean it. And everything I heard from your last answer was we talk about BetaKit stories and gossip. Chris, thank you for doing this.
We gossip about BetaKit stories.
100% you do. 100%. And my incredible fashion sense, which is an ironic thing to say given the photo that I know that we're going to use when this podcast goes up. Appreciate you taking the time to do this because you have been flying all over the place and you're about to take off again soon. But I'm really glad we could make this happen because there have been so many people who have been responding to the thoughtful writing that you've been putting out there just for the benefit of the ecosystem and are going to appreciate how much you dug into these questions to engage that we didn't even get to all of them. So we've got some overflow for the next AMA. So man, really appreciate it. And I hope we can have you back sometime before 10 years from now and see if you're like, no, I screwed this one up.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Really enjoyed being here. And I look forward to tackling the next round of questions.
The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.